change blindness, which is what the moonwalking bear video and the video you just watched demonstrates. It tells us that when we don't expect to see something, it easily slides past our awareness. And in addition, it turns out people don't multitask very well at all. We're good at sequentially paying attention to things, but not simultaneously. So if you're counting passes, you can miss something as obvious as a moonwalking bear or a gorilla or a Victorian lady passing through with a parasol over her head. I mean, researchers have used multiple types of bizarre stimuli in the middle of change blindness demonstrations, and they all turn out to be something that's difficult for people to see. Another limitation of our control processing system is that when System 1, the automatic system, has mastered something, System 2 can't stop it. The program in our head runs itself against our will, as this next example shows. So pause the video and then say the color of the ink for each of these items and go down the list as fast as you can. And once you've done that, continue the video. All right, easy, right? So, of course, we've learned our colors early and often. But now we're going to do the hard part. Again, pause the video when you get to the next slide so you can do the task on your own time. Try to go as quickly as possible. In groups of people, what happens is generally the crowd starts out strong, saying the ink color correctly in unison, but about halfway down the list, people start getting mixed up and we kind of dissolve into laughter by the end of it because it's so hard. Something that should be so easy turns out to be really difficult. It's called the Stroop effect. And it shows that reading is so automatic, it's not really under our control, so it interferes with naming the color. Of course you can do it, but you have to slow down and concentrate, and even so you can make mistakes. So implicit biases are like the Stroop effect, automatic programs that run in our heads without our volition, which can interfere with what we want to do. And they're also like chain blindness. If you don't know to look for something, i.e. the fact that we have implicit biases, we literally can't see it. System 1 corresponds to implicit biases, and it's measured using computerized tasks that capture reaction times in milliseconds, thousandths of a second, and those are our automatic responses. System 2 corresponds to explicit biases, and they're usually measured with self-reported surveys, and that, of course, captures our controlled responses. People can edit their responses on explicit measures, and they cannot edit their responses on implicit measures. And here's the thing, while System 1 and System 2 can indeed operate independently, they are inseparable, right? They're housed in the same brain, so we should not think of them as strangers. And what I mean when I say they can operate independently is that your score on an implicit measure may not correlate with your score on an explicit measure. So that suggests that they are independently informing your reactions and responses. We define implicit biases as automatic, that is, well-learned, sometimes I say routinized, cognitive associations between group members and evaluation, good or bad. That's called implicit prejudice or implicit attitude. And then also between group members and qualities such as powerful or warm, and those are called implicit stereotypes. For example, people spontaneously associate forgetful and frail with old people more than young people, and they associate leader and authority with men more than with women. So I think of these as cogmates, cognitive partners, cogmates for short. But what they really are also are mental ruts. We have like grooves that have been metaphorically carved into our brains so that these things that get linked together over time, over and over again, create a mental rut, and it's hard for us to think in different ways. Amazingly, researchers find robust evidence for implicit biases despite solid evidence that people's self-reported prejudices are on the wane, and they've been decreasing since about the 1960s, to the point now where it's normative to be firmly against many kinds of prejudice, especially racism. So when whites rate how warm or favorable they feel toward blacks using something called a thermometer rating, and then they repeat the rating for attitudes towards whites, on average, they circle the same number for both. A different score reveals, in that case, no explicit prejudice. But reliance on self-reports has tempted some scholars to pronounce racial bias a thing of the past, as old-fashioned as garters, and to announce that we now live in a post-racial society. We saw a great deal of this after Obama was elected in 2008. But implicit biases bring us to a different conclusion. Really, tens of millions of people have taken the black-white IET at Project Implicit. And what we find on average is 82% of whites show pro-white bias, but only 46% of blacks show pro-black bias. Moreover, the race IET and explicit attitudes do not correlate well for either whites or blacks. For whites, that's because they report no prejudice, but on the race IET, they do show prejudice. And for blacks, it's because they report strong pro-black attitudes, but then on the IET, their scores tend to be neutral. So why don't blacks favor their own group on the race IET? Because after all, social identity theory would argue that it's universal for people to prefer their in-groups over their out-groups. And the answer comes from cultural status differences. They favor whites. Historically, we've never lived in a society in which blacks had higher status than whites or even equal status. So that helps to explain why whites, 82% of them favor their own group when they take the black-white IET, even though they might report being very egalitarian on surveys. By contrast, blacks show neutral or even slight pro-white bias on the race IET, with only 46% automatically favoring their group, regardless of their explicit pride. So cultural status differences guide implicit biases for so many other identities that it's almost a rule. High status groups implicitly prefer their own group more than low status groups. Christians prefer their own group over Jews more than Jews prefer Jews over Christians. Rich people show more in-group bias than poor people do. Young people more than old people. Slim people more than heavyweight people. Even Stanford college students, Stanford University students show more implicit in-group bias than San Jose college students, right? Stanford University, of course, has more prestige than San Jose College does. And whites, I said already, whites more than blacks, but also whites more than Asians and Hispanics, and Asians and Hispanics more so than blacks. So like the Stroop, implicit biases stem from System 1, which has learned cultural biases so well, they are outside of our control, like reading. Therefore, wanting to be unbiased is not the same as being unbiased. Measures like the IET reveal how much we inherit biases from our culture, right? It's like our cultural heritage, whether we like it or not. And that makes it tough for System 2 to override them. So Project Implicit, I sent you there in order to find out, when you took the gender career IAT, did you find it relatively easy to associate men with career and women with family compared with vice versa, when you were obliged to associate men with family and women with career. What about men with science and women with liberal arts on the gender science IAT? On average, people possess robust implicit gender role and academic stereotypes. So if you found out from your feedback that you do in fact have these automatic associations, you are in the majority. So how does IAT work? It's really based on a simple but ingenious principle that it's easier to categorize two things together that are well associated compared with when you have to categorize two things together that are not cogmates. On the hard task, System 1 interferes with System 2, causing us to slow down and make mistakes, just like the Stroop. So the IAT starts with practice blocks. For example, first you sort men from women, and then you sort career from family before it randomly assigns the order of the double categorization blocks, when you either categorize men with family and women with career first, or you categorize men with career and women with family first before you're obliged to reverse the task instructions. So first of all, people are a little bit skeptical if they receive feedback that they have automatic biases, and they often ask about practice effects. So someone might say, first I sorted men with career and women with family, which is the traditional stereotype. Then I had to reverse those associations. But what if I had first sorted women with career and men with family? Wouldn't my IAT score change to be less biased? The IAT does show practice effects, but they're so small that the answer is no. Practice effects do not explain your IAT score. So how is IAT scored? Well, it's the speed difference in milliseconds between performing these two double categorization tasks. It's taken as the hard task minus the easy task, and then that's divided by the standard deviation of all your responses. Why do we do that? Because it accounts for the fact that some people are just faster or slower than other people are doing these kinds of tasks. So the result is a standardized D score on which 0 equals no bias. If it takes longer to perform the hard task, like women plus career, compared with the easy task, women plus family, then your D score will be positive, because longer times minus shorter times equals a positive number. So both genders show robust evidence of male career and male science stereotypes, and these are all positive attributes, just like the power warmth IAT I told you about before. But suppose the male and female words were mapped with good words like sunshine, gold, and heaven, and bad words like vomit, stink, and death, and scored so that a positive D score equals in-group bias in terms of attitude. What would you expect for this gender attitude IAT? And it turns out there's a sex difference. Let's see if you can guess what it is, keeping in mind two competing hypotheses. First, social identity theory predicts that men and women will both show in-group bias, strongly favoring their own group to the same extent, right? There won't be any gender differences, but there'll be a gender difference in terms of which group is preferred, okay? But by contrast, we might expect instead that men's in-group bias will be stronger than women's, because high-status group members often favor themselves more than low-status group members. For example, I told you already that whites show stronger in-group bias than blacks do on the race IAT, and young people show stronger in-group bias than old people do on the age IAT. So, keeping these two hypotheses in mind, let's see if you can formulate one. Which way do you think we're going to go on this before we go on?